It was the worst of wars. A war fought in a mountainous, rocky, treacherous terrain. With extremes of heat and cold, snow and ice, mud, stink, and choking dust. And all in an obscure place on the fringes of the geography books.
To me, the Korean War was the most difficult conflict in American history.
The Korean War, a fight many feared to be the beginning of World War III, a monumental conflict marked by panic and moments of stunning courage, by retreat and advance, misunderstanding and blunder.
Korea in the summer of 1950 and into the fall was the dirtiest, nastiest place I've ever been in.
In 3 years of fighting in Korea, nearly as many Americans will die as in a decade of battle in Vietnam. On all sides, military and civilian, there will be nearly 4 million dead. It is the defining struggle of the Cold War, a battleground on which the use of nuclear weapons is a frightening possibility. And it is the first and only time Western and communist superpowers have squared off on the battlefield, head to head and hand to hand.
Personal death is a small thing. Defending the country is a big thing. We must ensure the happiness of the people. I was not afraid of dying.
Today, the Korean War is largely forgotten. Like a nightmare so gruesome, it cannot survive the memory of mourning. Forgotten, except to those who were really there.
I hadn't had a bath in 10 days. We lived like cavemen. My friend told me, I know we're going to heaven because now we're spending our time in hell.
June 24th, 1950. All seems quiet in Korea, an Asian peninsula known as the land of the morning calm. Just 5 years before, at the end of World War II, the Americans and Soviets divided Korea at the 38th parallel. And yet, despite saber rattling, border clashes, and bellicose threats, on this day, there is peace. Early the next morning on June 25th, all pretense of serenity is shattered. North Korean Communist forces begin an intense barrage of artillery and mortar fire, the message of which is unmistakable.
I was in Army headquarters in Seoul and thought that the problem was restricted to the 38th parallel.
But then we got word that this was very serious. It wasn't just a skirmish. It was an invasion.
In the hope of forcing the reunification of the North and South as one communist-ruled country, North Korean Premier Kim Il-sung unleashes 100,000 well-trained and well-armed combat troops. They swarm into the South, meeting little resistance from a brave but ill-prepared South Korean army. Within 3 days, South Korea's capital, Seoul, falls. Refugees flee further south, the North soldiers in hot pursuit.
The situation was very horrible, beyond my imagination. We were caught between the North Korean soldiers and the South Korean soldiers. People tried crossing the river in rubber-tired tube. It was horrible. Everybody was pushing to cross the river.
News of the invasion crosses the Sea of Japan to the Tokyo headquarters of General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. A young staff lieutenant gets the word.
Late in the morning, I received a telephone call in that context from the then ambassador to South Korea, Ambassador Mushio. It was a very bad connection with a crackling line, and I can recall very vividly his describing what he then said was the real McCoy. MacArthur, in his classic fashion, said, "Very well, assemble the staff, and I will be in at 7 o'clock this evening to receive your recommendations." Well, that unleashed a scurrying which continued certainly through the 12 months that followed.
MacArthur flies to South Korea and assesses the situation. He cables Washington. An emergency session of the United Nations Security Council is called. Korea is the first real test of the world body, just 5 years old. The Security Council passes a unanimous resolution urging members to render such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel armed attack.
Gentlemen, we face a serious situation. We hope we face it in the cause of peace. The only reason for the action which was taken on advice of all the brains that I could muster was hoping, always hoping, that we'll finally arrive at the peace in the world which we anticipated when we created the United Nations. That's the only reason for the action. Thank you very much.
In Washington, President Harry S. Truman fears the North Korean invasion is just the beginning of a communist master plan to conquer the free world. Truman is convinced the Korea attack is nothing more than a trick. The real threat, he believes, is a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Frustrated by 5 years of communist arrogance in the Cold War, Truman is determined to join the fight. Privately, he tells his daughter, "By God, I'm going to let them have it." Yet, he enters battle with a military barely more than 1/10 the size of his World War II forces.
Into Korea along the U.S. Air Force route from Japan for on-the-scene films from inside Asia's crisis point. With communist invaders pouring south past the 38th parallel, their prong-like attacks have already enveloped many South Korean units. And more Southern Korean troops were rushed up to fill in the gaps.
The first American combatants are 540 men flown over from MacArthur's occupation army in Japan.
And people cheered us as we were going in. But as we sat in the railroad station waiting for the to depart, we could see train loads, boxcar loads of Korean soldiers, wounded Korean soldiers, sitting in the sidings next to us. And right then is the first time it really set in that we were going into something serious.
Designated Task Force Smith, they are almost as ill-equipped and trained as the South Koreans. Their mission is clear: to stop the North Korean advance.
The thing that I remember hearing is, all we need is someone up there who won't run when they see the tanks. That's the thing that is embedded in my mind as what we were told that we were expected to do, to stay there and fight the tanks.
July 5th, 1950. In rain and haze, the soldiers of Task Force Smith are entrenched outside the town of Osan. Headed straight into their positions is a column of Soviet-made T-34 tanks.
We were hitting the tanks. Absolutely no problem of hitting it, but it didn't make any difference. That was my first appreciation that we had a serious set of problems.
Task Force Smith has been issued outdated anti-tank weapons that already had proven useless against German armor in World War II. The North Korean tanks barrel through the American barrage.
The first thing is disbelief. That here our Army, my Army, has told me all along that this is a fine anti-tank weapon. And they sent us over here to stop the tanks, and this thing won't do it.
Dazed and overwhelmed. Radios knocked out by the rain. With 155 casualties, Task Force Smith retreats, succumbing to a disease of the spirit that becomes known as bug-out fever.
The panic is contagious. It's the most contagious of the various things that happen to soldiers. You think, you think that a cold or the flu is contagious. Try panic. It's faster and it's more complete.
In the wet and the chaos, many of the men of Task Force Smith wander the countryside for days, trying to get back to the safety of the rear. As more American troops arrive, the chaos continues. Eugene Jones and his twin brother Charlie are cameramen for NBC News.
I couldn't believe what I saw. I was appalled. There was no organized American fight, no resistance. People were near hysterical with fear, eyes bulging, running up and down the streets. I'd come out of World War II with the Marine Corps, and I knew that Korea was a tough fight, but I couldn't believe that this was happening. And it's horrifying to see one's countrymen in defeat. I felt right then that we would be very lucky indeed if we could hold on to that peninsula.
The images Gene and Charlie send home are among the first of the war seen by the American public. One of their initial film dispatches captures the agony and frustration the Army grapples with in those early days of combat.
I could hear the gasping cries of this man, Charlie demanding that two other men come up there and help him down, drag him down. What he said was, "God damn it, come up here, grab him. I need help if we're gonna save him." At that moment, one of the wounded men slithered down the hill. He was a big guy, strong, proud, but I'll never forget, he crawled over to where we were, and he sort of crooned. He said, "Oh, Sully, they got you. They got you, Sully. What a damn shame." He saw somebody he loved in terrible pain. We thought Sully would make it. We thought sure he was, because he wasn't badly wounded, but suddenly from lying flat, unexpectedly, he sat up rigidly, his fists clenched, his lips murmured unheard words, his eyes fluttered, and he dropped back and died. I thought for days about him, about his, I remember his face.
At the end of World War II, the United States had emerged triumphant, the greatest power in the history of the world. Now, just 5 years later, the U.S. faces humiliation and defeat in a country that's name has been unknown to most Americans only days before. It is a bitter and humbling turn of events. July 15th, 1950. North Korea and its tanks continue to roll through the south, like the Nazi blitzkrieg across France 10 years earlier. All the overpowered American and South Korean troops can do is delay what increasingly seems inevitable: defeat. In the United States, now that the public has figured out where Korea is, the overriding question becomes, why? The Korean Peninsula lies at an Asian crossroad, a strategic location near China, the Soviet Union, and Japan. Koreans were known to describe their land as a small rabbit constantly being fought over by its larger, more aggressive neighbors. Occupied by Japan from 1910 to 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided in two, with loyalties split north and south, between East and West. The United States supports South Korea and its American-educated President Syngman Rhee, a fervent anti-communist. The Soviet Union pours massive military and economic aid into North Korea and seals off its border with the South. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin installs a puppet regime led by dictator Kim Il-sung.
It was Soviet influence, Soviet support, which of course led to the attack against the South. I could see after I got on the ground there that the evidence of heavy Russian presence throughout North Korea and in the South with the invading forces was all too clear.
By the spring of 1950, the decision by Stalin has been made. The North Koreans will invade the South and unite the peninsula under communist rule. Now, in mid-July, as the Allies' hold on the South grows more precarious, the United Nations appoints the most powerful man in Asia, General Douglas MacArthur, to take command. More than anyone, MacArthur symbolizes American strength in the East. A giant of World War II, he is the "I shall return" hero of the Philippines, who whose bloody island-by-island campaign helped defeat Japan.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
It was MacArthur who presided over the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri, and MacArthur who since the war's end has overseen the Allied occupation of Japan. Like a sun king, he rules the defeated country with absolute power and is revered not only by Americans, but by the conquered.
In Japan, he was Lord and Master. Don't ever get the idea that they already had a real hero worship for the emperor, and this is the man that the emperor goes to see. This is the man that the emperor bows down to, and everybody and his little brother had always bowed down to the emperor.
MacArthur's imperial and self-righteous manner is off-putting to many, including President Truman. Although they have never met and the president respects the general's military skills, he fears MacArthur's a loose cannon. Truman calls him a prima donna brass hat, a play actor and bunco man. Not everyone shares that opinion.
I must say that I was simply in awe of the personality and the imposing character which one saw. He was both dignified, very self-controlled. He was an imposing figure in terms of his physical appearance, both fit and handsome, with a booming and resonant voice and an incredible mastery of the English language. When he spoke extemporaneously, one could see that it could almost be written down verbatim and be as eloquent as something that one had tortured over for hours.
Ever the lover of military history, MacArthur strides to war in Korea, accompanied by one of his favorite regiments, the Army's 7th Cavalry. The 7th was itself a legend, the unit once led by George Armstrong Custer. Private Marvin Daniel was a high school dropout who joined the 7th looking for adventure.
When we landed there, my thoughts, speaking from a 17-year-old thinking and viewpoints at that time, I thought that when the North Koreans observed us landing there in force, that they would just take off back up north where they came from, because I didn't think it was going to be a war of the magnitude that it was.
MacArthur's love of the past blinds him to the reality of the present. First, the North Koreans are not the barefoot, third world rabble he has arrogantly assumed. Second, the U.S. military is not the same fighting force that won World War II. Since 1945, the American defense budget has been slashed from $82 to $13 billion. The armed forces cut from 12 million men and women to 1.6 million. In Japan, the 7th Cavalry had been acting as policemen with little training and antiquated weapons. Now, they are in a real shooting war.
An officer from the 7th Cav came up to relieve my unit. And I said, if you look back over your shoulder there, you'll see on the side of the hill there's a draw with a slash right above it. I said, that's where we're going to assemble when we get run out of here. And he drew himself up and looked me in the eye, and he said, we came over here to fight, not run like you people did. And really, I felt sorry for him at the time, because he didn't have any idea what was about to happen to him.
August 1950, United Nations forces and the South Korean army seemed powerless before the North Korean juggernaut. Only 30 miles more, and the UN will be pushed all the way back to the port city of Pusan, and literally out to sea.
I guess the feeling was that we weren't going to stay in Korea. That the North Koreans were making such rapid advances down the west coast and center of Korea that soon we'd be evacuating Pusan. And it was into that situation that we, the Marine Brigade, was being thrown. The defeatism on the part of the Army troops was amazing, and even the officers that we talked to.
No matter how often small groups of our men bravely stood and fought, it wasn't enough. Those Koreans were experts with straight trajectory artillery fire, mortars, machine guns, and rifles. They were good shots. They were brave, they were well-trained, disciplined, and they were hard. And our people were just totally incapable of withstanding those kinds of assaults. It was as if some great slow wave was just rolling down Korea. Village after village, our people tried to make a stand. They could never hold.
Many began to develop a resignation that we would soon have to be withdrawing from the peninsula. MacArthur never accepted that premise. In fact, he rejected, in my hearing on countless occasions, any talk of a need to withdraw. He knew that we could hold. And it was his character and that of General Walton Walker, who commanded our Pusan perimeter, that I think performed the impossible.
Atop hills overlooking the south bank of the Naktong River, General Walton Walker establishes a final defense line. Dug in along the river is the 7th Cavalry.
Every battalion was doing all they could to preserve and protect the Pusan perimeter long enough to start getting replacements from the States. So everybody took it hard, took a lot of casualties. There was ongoing fire coming over the Naktong River continuously. General Walker had told us, no further withdrawal. This is it.
It is the beginning of the fight back.
Frontline films from Korea. Troops of the 1st Cavalry Division guardedly move forward to occupy a slope in the bloody Waigon area. Backing them up are tanks of the United Nations forces to help hold back the Red Korean divisions, reportedly massing for a power drive on nearby Taegu.
In heat and dust so thick it clogs their guns and vehicles, the 7th Cavalry fights on. Just weeks before, Marvin Daniel had been sure the North Koreans would turn and run. Now he is seeing more carnage than he ever dreamed possible.
There was a lieutenant and a sergeant that was walking. They walked by me at about 25 feet down the hill from where I was. I heard this terrible explosion right between the sergeant and the lieutenant. The lieutenant stood up, and one of his legs had been blown away, and he was riddled from his neck down. And he looked at me and said, "Don't bother with me, I'm dead," and he fell over, and he died shortly after. After this, I had an empty feeling. I didn't know what to do. I mean, you know, I was trying to grasp what I could do to cope with something like this.
The Lord is my shepherd.
And I had a little Bible.
I shall not want.
And I kind of got away from what had taken place there after everything settled down a bit and began to read the 23rd Psalm.
He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul.
The words in the scripture gave me comfort and a way to get through it.
They fight from hill to hill, back and forth, and still the Pusan line holds. Hill 303 near Waekwan is taken by the North Koreans, retaken by the Americans 3 days later, and a horrible discovery is made. 26 U.S. mortarmen taken prisoner by the Communist Army are dead. Gene Jones and his camera record the scene.
They were curled like babies, side by side, all of them with their hands tied by American Army communications wire. They were barefoot, their helmets were gone, and a row of black dots, burp gun slugs, laced their backs. They'd been executed. In effect, murdered. It was an atrocity. We had, for some reason, a chaplain, and I remember he got down in the ditch and he raised his hand and gave them the last rites. And around him were their helmets and packs, the letters from their families, pictures. It was a scene of terrible death. As we brought out the bodies, Chaplain Kiner turned to me. He just muttered, "Those North Koreans, the faces of men and the minds of animals."
They didn't go by the same rules that we did as American soldiers with and protect the prisoner of war. They were just the opposite. They couldn't care less. Made us sick to the stomach when we heard stories like that. They never imagined that would happen.
By the end of August, such stories and sights as Hill 303 strengthen the once faded resolve of the American troops. But food, water, and ammunition are in short supply. A breakthrough is needed to end the current stalemate at the Pusan perimeter, a bold idea that will move the war in a new direction. General MacArthur says he has one. In one master stroke, MacArthur believes he can win the war. He will stage a massive amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon.
When he presented this plan to the Pentagon, President Truman was highly skeptical, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended very vigorously against it. Truman then sent the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Tokyo to try to dissuade MacArthur from this risky military endeavor.
MacArthur himself admits that Incheon is a 5,000 to 1 gamble. The port's 32-foot tidal range is one of the highest in the world. Because of this erratic tidal flow, only one date is truly feasible for the invasion: September 15th.
I was a fly on the wall at the meeting of those individuals and can tell you that they all spoke out against it. MacArthur never said a word. At the end, he stood up, took that corncob pipe out of his mouth, put it rather noisily into the ashtray in front of him and said, "Gentlemen, I will be landing in Incheon in September, or you will have a new commander in the Far East." And walked out of the room, and as great as these World War II heroes were, and they were all that, they crumbled under the fortitude and the dominating character of Douglas MacArthur.
MacArthur says, "I can almost hear the ticking of the second hand of destiny. We shall land at Incheon, and I shall crush them." September 15th, 1950, MacArthur's D-Day has arrived. The Incheon invasion is either a bold move that will change the course of the Korean War, or a landing so bloody it may rival Iwo Jima or Normandy.
Incheon landing was a very calculated, even desperate gamble. We were not really ready for it.
Before Incheon can be taken, the Marines must capture the island of Walmido, which rests at the approaches to the landing site. The possibility of heavy resistance makes everyone apprehensive. Commanding a Marine battalion is Colonel Robert Taplett.
And we got a message from higher headquarters that we were to continue the landing on Walmido until we had 83% casualties. And that's when I got a little bit concerned. Because I said, my God, what are we getting into?
The Marines storm the island and meet surprisingly little resistance. In less than 90 minutes, Walmido is secure. Now they and the Army's 7th Infantry Division are poised to attack Incheon. One of the first to land is Major Edwin Simmons.
Luckily, the caliber of the resistance was low. The North Koreans defending the beach were not well trained. As I've said frequently, if the beach had been defended by Japanese or Germans of World War II caliber, it might have been different.
By the next day, Incheon is in the hands of the United Nations forces. MacArthur's roll of the dice has paid off.
Very dramatic figure. MacArthur in the crushed hat, the sunglasses, striding up this hill, flanked by all sorts of officers and bodyguards and newsreel photographers and correspondents. A conqueror, and looking 12 feet tall.
September 16th, 1950. The day after Incheon, the second part of the new Allied strategy is revealed. After weeks of pounding by the Communists, General Walton Walker's men begin a breakout of the Pusan perimeter. Leading the way is the 7th Cavalry. They push north and west to join up with the forces striking out from Incheon.
That was truly a great feeling. We were told load up on everything that we could get onto, and we were going to go due north, and we were going to move rapidly. And the idea was to terrorize, this time, the North Koreans, and we were going to tie in with the 7th Division coming down.
The entire course of the Korean War has changed in just 2 short days. Now it's the Americans on the offensive. They are closing in on Seoul, the South Korean capital. The battle for Seoul becomes the fight the Marines had expected at Incheon. After 3 days of fighting, street to street, the South Korean flag is raised.
These films reached the United States. They are first pictures in the streets of the recaptured capital city of Seoul. While the Paramount News cameraman made this on-the-spot record, fighting was fierce along the battered and fire-gutted streets, the enemy no more than 500 yards ahead.
One sight that I will never forget, we had to take a high piece of ground, and one of my lieutenants called me on the radio and said, "Skipper, you better get up here, there's something for you to see." And so I went up the hill and there was a trench. And this one was filled with South Korean bodies, men, women, and children, hundreds of them who have been executed in that trench. And so I asked our Korean interpreters, what can this be? How could this happen? What did these people do? He said these people were just thought to be pro-American, or perhaps they were thought to be Christian, and so they were killed. And that was not isolated. The same sort of thing happened all over Korea.
September 29th, 1950. In an emotional ceremony at the National Assembly Building, MacArthur formally returns the city to President Syngman Rhee and the South Korean government.
But then he asked everybody in that voice of his, "Please stand while we recite the Lord's Prayer." And it was very dramatic. I mean, that guy was an actor, believe me. That was the most dramatic recital of the Lord's Prayer I ever heard in my life.
It is as triumphant a moment in MacArthur's career as his return to the Philippines. He is certain complete victory is now at hand. Watching the remarkable turn of events is Communist China's great chairman, Mao Zedong. Just a year earlier, Mao had gained control of China by defeating rival Chiang Kai-shek and his American-backed nationalist forces. He believes the United States intervention in Korea is an American scheme to expand into East Asia and perhaps China itself.
North Korea is communist like China, and we are brothers. If we didn't send forces to support our brothers when they were in danger, then American troops swallow them up and then invade our homeland.
Such views mirror those of Mao precisely. If the U.S. imperialists win, he says, they may get so dizzy with success that they may threaten us. Victories at Incheon and Seoul convince him that his prophecy is about to come true. Chairman Mao has 500,000 troops waiting in Manchuria. He is ready to use them.
Korea, military victory without the atom bomb. As news reached the world that South Korean troops had pushed clear to the Manchurian border, new films arrived in this country showing American soldiers rolling into the North Korean capital. Into Pyongyang, tanks of the 1st Cavalry Division made their way, past cheering civilians, and past thousands upon thousands of North Korean prisoners.
MacArthur and his troops think the Korean War is all but over. Washington gives him permission to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea in order to destroy the fleeing communist army. After all, Secretary of State Dean Acheson reasons, it would be ridiculous to march up to a surveyor's line and stop. Yet there is caution. MacArthur is warned to stop at any hint of Russian or Chinese intervention. And American forces are to halt well short of the Yalu River, North Korea's border with China's Manchuria. MacArthur ignores the orders.
The word was that when we got to the Yalu, or to the mouth of the Yalu, we were going to stop at the last hill before the river and form a defensive position. We were not to fire in the direction of the Yalu River, and that we would be relieved by South Korean troops, and then we were going home. And so it was a tremendous, exciting thing, because once we got that objective, well, then we were going home. So you say to me, how did we feel? We felt great.
For the first time since arriving in Korea, the 7th Cavalry begins to relax. Time for a shave, a beer, or a shot of whiskey. Even time to chase after a duck dinner.
Every soldier I ever saw had nothing but a big smile on his face, because as far as we were concerned, the war was truly over, and we were gone home, and we were going to be one of the first soldiers to parade. The whole 7th Cav Regiment. We paraded in downtown Tokyo for General MacArthur on Armistice Day.
In the midst of all the relief and jubilance, MacArthur receives a summons from President Truman. The president wants a face-to-face meeting, their first. It will be held at tiny Wake Island in the mid-Pacific. At home, Truman, a Democrat, is being attacked by Joe McCarthy and other right-wing Republicans, and midterm elections are just a couple of weeks away. A photo opportunity with America's brightest hero couldn't hurt. MacArthur sets off for Wake, peeved at being interrupted at the wind-up of his great campaign. As for Truman, he writes to a cousin, "I've a whale of a job before me. Have to talk to God's right-hand man tomorrow."
In this spirit, the president flew to Wake Island for the momentous parley. Arriving at daybreak, he met his Pacific commander for the first time face to face. The world heard later they shared a complete unanimity of view on the Korean War.
Truman is genuinely concerned about Chinese threats to enter the war. MacArthur assures the president that there will be no Russian or Chinese intervention. If the Chinese tried to get into Pyongyang, he says, there would be the greatest slaughter. The war, he insists, will be over by Thanksgiving.
He wanted to win. This was his idea of a trophy. This was his idea of accomplishment.
October 15th, 1950. On the very day MacArthur guarantees the Chinese will not intervene, Mao dispatches the first of 250,000 troops across the Yalu River into North Korea.
We crossed at Shanmadong, a joint point between China and Korea. The first station we crossed was Shinyi-zhou. There was a large army supply factory where they were producing army uniforms. We learned those uniforms were for Chinese soldiers in Korea.
Increasingly, American and South Korean troops report encounters with soldiers believed to be Chinese. MacArthur is dismissive. He thinks it's nothing more than a handful of Chinese volunteers.
I reported to GHQ in Tokyo. MacArthur's headquarters said, "Oh no, they are not the Chinese army." So the responsibility of this should go to MacArthur.
Oblivious, the confident MacArthur urges his men onward. He watches as a drop of 4,000 paratroopers go in to trap the North Korean army and save American POWs.
Down on the ground, British soldiers of the UN Army driving north link up with American units coming south, and the trap is complete.
As far as the Chinese are concerned, the trap is theirs. They believe they have guilefully lured the Americans far too deep into the north. The Chinese military leader, Marshal Peng, tells his staff, in order to hook a big fish, you must let the fish taste your bait. MacArthur boasts that he has never been defeated. We'll see who is going to wipe out whom. In less than 6 months, the United States has seen the fortunes of war swing from staggering defeat to near total victory. Now, events will conspire for one more dramatic and potentially catastrophic change. November 1950. Winter settles in on the Korean Peninsula. Raw, sharp, hard, and bitter. Since June, the United States and its United Nations allies have fought the communist invasion of South Korea. In the brutal heat of the Korean summer, American troops confronted something the U.S. military had not experienced in years: defeat.
It was constant combat. It never let up. Never. You always knew that tomorrow there was going to be more shooting.
But in September, the commander of the United Nations forces, the legendary General Douglas MacArthur, has seized the initiative and imaginations with a bold amphibious assault on the port city of Incheon. Now the communists are on the run, and the Allies determined to pursue them across the 38th parallel into North Korea. By late November, complete and total victory is within grasp. But MacArthur has ignored at his peril signals of a dangerous new twist in the bloody fight for Korea. This sudden change will bring two superpowers face to face on the battlefield and result in a time in hell soldiers on all sides will never forget.
It was living hell, hell on earth. That's what it was. It couldn't have been no worse anywhere, any time, any place on earth is that. It was a pure living hell.
I just didn't believe that it was over. I couldn't, there wasn't anything I could put my finger on. I guess you'd call it a gut feel.
It is called the Home by Christmas Offensive. The 8th Army and the heroes of Incheon, the 10th Corps, hoped to end the Korean War by advancing to the south bank of the Yalu River, North Korea's border with Manchurian China. Despite concern from Washington, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the United Nations forces, is sure the Chinese would not dare retaliate. Soldiers in the field are not as confident. In North Korea, with MacArthur's chief of staff, is Lieutenant Alexander Haig.
And we began to pick up prisoners. Prisoners who were well equipped, obviously extremely well trained, and fully outfitted for winter warfare. We would go back and write rather alarming messages to Tokyo, and Tokyo just simply seemed unwilling to face it.
Of far more immediate concern to the men on the battle lines is the icy curse of winter. Freezing winds from Siberia send temperatures to 40 below zero. Canteens burst. Equipment snaps like glass. Oil freezes in weapons, rendering them useless. The men lack proper winter clothing. Every motion is slow and labored.
I have never experienced cold like that before. It was just, well, bone chilling doesn't begin to describe it. We went through the chow line and they put on the mashed potatoes and the gravy and the chicken, and then I had to walk maybe about 50 yards back to my foxhole. And by the time I got back to that foxhole, the gravy had frozen, the chicken was cold, but it sure tasted good anyways.
It takes cups of snow to even get a drink. Your feet are always cold, no matter what you do. It was cold. You sleep in it, you eat in it, you live in it, you fight in it.
Winter is an equal opportunity hardship. It torments friend and foe alike. But now the cold conspires with the Chinese to create one of the greatest disasters in American military history. Over the course of a few weeks, right under the noses of United States intelligence, Chairman Mao Zedong has ordered 250,000 Chinese soldiers across the Yalu River into Korea. The Chinese are a people who have spent centuries on the defensive against invading foreign powers. And now, a new threat, the vast American-dominated fighting force at their very border.
They told us that U.S. imperialists were invading Korea and taking Korea as a jumping board to invading China. So we called it the anti-U.S., aiding Korea War, because we assisted Korea and stopped American aggression. It was like guarding the motherland.
November 27, 1950. Marching into a Chinese trap are the soldiers of 10th Corps. They are unaware that 100,000 communist troops wait for them in the rugged terrain surrounding a place that will symbolize all the desperation and heroism of war in Korea, the Chosin Reservoir. Mao Zedong's military tactician Marshal Peng has a simple strategy. Lure the enemy forces into our internal line, he says. Wipe them out, one by one.
And it was amazing how those Chinese were able to infiltrate all the way from Manchuria down and occupy all those ridges and mountains around Udamni, Hagaruri, on the east side of the Chosin Reservoir, Coterie. It was just amazing that our air, or somebody didn't see them moving down.
I could see Chinese coming south, down in the valley, and it looked like a wheat field. It was so many people. They were moving and weaving. It looked like a wind blowing across a wheat field. And I knew they were coming from the north, and they were coming south.
"10,000 Marines and 2,500 soldiers of the U.S. Army are on either side of the Chosin Reservoir. On the west side, Marine Colonel Robert Taplett's battalion is one of the first to be hit. He is shocked by what he sees.
I was absolutely stunned. I'd never seen Marines in that shape before. They were obviously in a lot of shock, not only from being overrun by the Chinese, but also from the cold. And there they were, without weapons, some of them barefooted, some of them in shorts, and they were damn near frozen stiff.
Despite being outnumbered 10-1, the Marines are determined not to abandon their equipment or their wounded and dead.
I think what tore me up more than anything else coming out of the reservoir were the truckloads of dead Marines that we had loaded up like so much firewood or logs in these trucks, their bodies frozen, rigid. In some of the pictures you'll see the feet sticking out from the trucks, and that's the way it was. We were going to take out every body, and we did.
On the east side of the reservoir, the Army's 7th Infantry Division is in even more fatal trouble than the Marines to the west.
On the east side, the reservoir is getting extremely desperate because they had at least 2 airdrops in there, and most of the supplies landed in the Chinese sectors. They were running out of ammunition. They were running out of food. They had no way to heat anything. They had no water. The men were eating chunks of snow they were so dehydrated. It was getting worse and worse.
Fighting for his life is Corporal John Durham.
Hell, I was scared to death, man. I was so scared one time I thought my heart was going to quit. I could hear it beating, you know. I've heard guys say, I wasn't scared, but you know what, he's lying. Anyone that's ever been in combat, they're scared as hell, or they're crazy, you know.
The men of the 7th Infantry fight bravely, but are overwhelmed by the mass attacks of the Chinese. Their only escape route south to the town of Hagaru is cut off. Facing annihilation, they abandon their vehicles and have no opportunity to collect their dead.
I saw men that had fought and got shot in both legs and couldn't walk. I saw men crawling, pulling themselves with their elbows, still fighting with their legs shot out from under. I saw some men just give up. They were so tired. They were beat. They were pushed so long that, you know, their endurance had run out. They gave up. They couldn't stand it no longer. And I said, hey, come on, fellas, don't give up. Don't give them bastards the opportunity to shoot you between the eyes. Get up from there and let's go. And so I can't go no further. I'm tired of this, and I don't care if they do shoot me, you know. And that's the way it was.
Durham is one of the lucky few. There had been 2,500 men on the east side of the Chosin. Only 1,000 make it out alive.
I had this feeling that somehow I was going to survive. It didn't matter. And God was going to take care of me, and somehow I was going to make it out of there. And you know, I did. And you know, I believe that till this day. I think it, by the grace of God, I was spared because I cried and begged God to spare my life.
All doubts have vanished in a nightmare of death and blood. The Chinese are in the war for real. In a blaze of gunfire, America's hopes for total victory have turned to ash.
China's Red Army, creator of the newest and gravest world crisis. Mao Zedong, communist ruler, reviews his men. 280,000 of them have swarmed into North Korea and thrown back the United Nations forces there, threatening a new world war.
General Douglas MacArthur has tickled the tail of the giant Chinese dragon and is now paying the ghastly price. Just a few weeks earlier at Wake Island, he had guaranteed President Harry Truman that China would never enter the war. Now, at the Chosin Reservoir and throughout all of North Korea, his United Nations forces are in headlong retreat. Foot soldiers and commanders alike begin to question the leadership and judgment of Douglas MacArthur.
MacArthur, in my opinion, is probably a tremendous egotist, that he could never be wrong. Whatever he had done previously in his life, he'd always been very successful. And I think he probably had around him a lot of incompetent staff people that were good yes men. They kept saying, yes, yes, General, and whatever you said. You're right, General. Nobody ever probably raised their voice to General MacArthur and said, General, you ever consider that maybe you're wrong?
MacArthur counters criticism by saying the Truman administration is forcing him to fight with one hand tied behind his back. He wants to expand the war into China, but Washington says no. Meanwhile, the agony of 10th Corps goes on. They have regrouped in the town of Hagaru, south of the deadly Chosin Reservoir. Troops and vehicles crowd together. The men are in desperate need of supplies and reinforcements and are still surrounded by the Chinese. They are battered by the now familiar lethal combination. Fearsome Chinese attacks by night and the relentless, vicious cold. Frostbite is as dangerous as a gunshot wound. Stanley Wolfe is a physician assigned to 10th Corps.
They kept their boots on for 2 or 3 days at a time, and the inner sole, which had some perspiration in it now, froze. And they had a layer of ice under their soles. So we would get these people in when they couldn't walk, and you look at their feet and you take the boot off, and it's just raw meat underneath them.
Medics carry morphine ampules in their mouths to keep the pain-killing narcotic from freezing. With wind chills as low as 70 below zero, everything turns to ice, men and blood.
I hope I never can see anything like that again, when you can picture people who were frozen, literally frozen. But when they're frozen, and then they've got these gunshot wounds and parts of the body that are hit by the bullets, then you've got the effects of that. And the blood was frozen on the surface. And when they thaw out, they'd start to bleed again. It was very, I'm sorry. It was difficult.
MacArthur orders his 10th Corps to fall back from Hagaru to the port city of Hungnam and evacuation by sea. One Marine commander insists, "I don't give a good goddamn how many Chinese there are between us and Hungnam. There aren't enough in the world to stop a Marine regiment going where it wants to go."
I think that what kept the men going was their regard for each other. And they didn't want to be the one that failed. They weren't at that point fighting for the United States or apple pie or anything else. They were fighting for Bill and John and George. And they weren't going to be the ones that didn't make it.
Every one of them had what we call the 1,000-yard stare. It's an utterly tired look, sleepless, you're gaunt-faced. And yet, some sort of an indomitable will shows through. You got me pushed back, buddy, but you haven't got me beat. You want some more? Let's go at it again. That's what I call the 1,000-yard stare. Every one of those men had it.
The breakout begins. Army troops of the 10th Corps create a defensive corridor through which the Marines can escape. One particularly narrow stretch becomes known as Hellfire Alley, the perfect place for a Chinese ambush. Marine Colonel Robert Taplett found his way with some advice from a battle-savvy chaplain.
He said, "Do you want to go to confession? I'm a Catholic." And I said, "Yeah, Father, well, what's there to confess in Korea?" And anyway, I went to confession, and he said, "Hey, Tap," he said, "for your penance, just say this. When the going gets rough during the breakout, just say, 'Not my will, but thy will be done.'" And boy, I said that 1,000 times on the way out. And it worked.
American troops grimly hold on to the diminishing Hungnam beachhead. With 100,000 fanatical Chinese squeezing this last UN position in North Korea, the hard-pressed 10th Corps battles for its life under the protection of the U.S. 7th Fleet.
December 10, 1950, 2 weeks after the first Chinese attacks, the beleaguered men of 10th Corps begin trickling into Hungnam. By Christmas Eve, the final remnants are loaded onto ships and sent south to Pusan. 105,000 troops and 91,000 Korean refugees have been evacuated. Left on the Hungnam beach are gasoline, bombs, and dynamite, believed too volatile for transport. The Americans blow them up. A final gesture of fury and exasperation.
It made me sad, made me angry. I wanted to get another bite of their sandwich. I wanted to take some of those Chinese with us. I wanted to make them pay for what they had done. It's a feeling that a soldier has. It's payback time.
The Chinese, who have suffered even greater casualties from battle and the fierce winter, have succeeded in driving all United Nations forces back below the 38th parallel. Mao Zedong has his great victory, a surprise and success that rival that of MacArthur's at Incheon. He decides to take the offensive and force the West out of Korea for good. As a result, a panic-stricken America considers a potentially calamitous, desperate act. Reeling from the power and ferocity of the Chinese offensive in Korea, the United States faces the very real possibility of total and humiliating defeat. General Douglas MacArthur finds this unthinkable and advocates the use of as many as 50 atomic bombs against the Chinese. The notion of giving MacArthur such a weapon appalls American allies, who fear that its use would not only result in needless mass slaughter, but lead to a third world war with China and the Soviet Union, engulfing Europe in nuclear holocaust. Their dread only worsens with a November 30th White House press conference.
It was here that Mr. Truman made a remark that startled the world and made headlines everywhere. It was interpreted to mean we may use the atom bomb if necessary.
Oh, they were ready to use any nuclear weapon that Truman would give them. Yes, they were ready to use atomic weapons and could have and would have, particularly with Truman being president. He had used them before, he'd use them again.
The Chinese vow to fight on, no matter what the United States hurls at them. You can use the atomic bomb, Mao Zedong counters. I will use my hand grenade. I will catch your weak point and defeat you.
As the world looked down the red throat of war, to Washington came British Prime Minister Clement Attlee for Korean crisis talks with President Truman. There was momentary relaxation for picture-taking, but ahead were hours of momentous discussion in the wake of Europe's anxiety lest the atom bomb be unleashed.
The president promises to confer with London before using atomic weapons in Korea. Ultimately, without need for consultation, Truman realizes dropping the bomb will widen the war, not end it.
Through the freezing wintry weather of North Korea, the United Nations forces fall back in the face of the massive Chinese Communist offensive.
The disaster at the Chosin Reservoir is being repeated all over North Korea. Hit hardest is the 8th Army. They withdraw from the Yalu River to south of the 38th parallel, moving 120 miles in just the first week and a half. It is the longest retreat in American military history. The men of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, are among those staggered by the size and fury of the Chinese assault.
Well, all along the whole line, the whole attack, as far as the Chinese would want to do, is one wave after another. They never gave up. Once they started, they just kept on moving, and they had many reemplacements and many reinforcements behind them, so they continue to do that.
Since arriving in Korea in July 1950, the 7th Cavalry has seen some of the toughest combat of the war. In October, they had been one of the first units to enter North Korea. Now, as the new year of 1951 approaches, they flee to the south. South Korea's capital, Seoul, once more falls into the hands of the communists. Even Incheon, site of America's greatest triumph in Korea, is relinquished. Its harbor is blown up to keep the food, weapons, and vehicles there from liberation by the Chinese and North Koreans. And then, one of those curious accidents of history occurs. On December 23, 1950, the 8th Army's commander, General Walton Walker, is killed when his Jeep collides with a South Korean Army truck. As great a tragedy as this is, his replacement will turn the 8th Army around and save it from certain destruction and disgrace. General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, 56 years old, a legendary World War II paratrooper who led airborne assaults at Sicily, Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge. MacArthur tells him, "The 8th Army is yours, Matt. Do what you think is best." What Ridgway does in an astoundingly short time is revive the fighting spirit of the 8th Army. He improves conditions for his troops with better and more food, clothes, weapons, and ammunition. Ridgway urges them to think like infantry, getting off the roads and targeting the hills where the Chinese hide.
And he told them to throw all those maps away. We're going to attack. And everybody in my meeting just roared with laughter. We thought that was the funniest thing we'd ever heard, that we're going to attack these people. And you know, in less than 3 weeks, General Ridgway had changed the entire attitude of the 8th Army. All we wanted to do was attack north, completely.
At the same time, Mao Zedong has made a serious error in judgment. As MacArthur had done before, Mao has moved his troops too far, too fast. His supply lines are overextended. Chairman Mao has let his ambition cloud his thinking. He has suffered far more casualties than the United States and its allies. His troops are cold and exhausted. Their revolutionary fervor and morale are in decline. Reinforcements are untrained, ill-equipped, reluctant conscripts.
The Communist Party used two methods of treatment when they asked ordinary people to join the army. If they refused to join, they were forced to sit on a hot furnace. When they stood up, that meant they were ready to volunteer and go to the battlefield.
Although they still outnumber the United Nations troops, the Chinese lack the firepower of the Allies. They have little artillery and no attack aircraft in Korea.
The Chinese weapons were crude compared to the Americans. The Americans used missiles that looked like stars in the sky, and they fell here and there. This was their strength.
Pinned down by American fighters and bombers during the day, the Chinese are forced to hide in caves and tunnels. They can only attack at night.
The environment and the condition were terribly poor and rough. We never got to drink any hot water for a year. The water was filthy. We had nothing to eat. We couldn't cook because the smoke gave away our position, and we would be bombed.
Once more in this incredible saga of war, the tide is about to turn yet another time. And with it will come the end of one of America's most dazzling military careers. March 1951. While General Matthew Ridgway successfully counterattacks the Chinese, another fight is simmering, one that will rock the world and briefly overshadow the real battlefield. The Truman administration now favors a limited war, one that can beat the enemy back to a position from which peace talks can begin. General Douglas MacArthur, however, has his own foreign policy. There's no substitute for victory, he says, and that means all-out war with China. Despite warnings from the president himself, MacArthur continues to vent his frustration, loudly and often. To help shore up deteriorating relations between Washington and MacArthur in Tokyo, Defense Secretary George Marshall sends American Legion Commander Earl C. Koch to speak with the general.
He wanted to do the full job for Korea. He didn't want to do a part-time job, was the way he always expressed it.
Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon refused to yield to MacArthur and his Republican supporters in Congress. MacArthur infuriates Truman with his continued interference and pronouncements. The general's meddling and criticism so aggravate the president, he says he wants to kick MacArthur into the North China Sea.
He thought he was running a better government in Japan than you are running a better government in Washington, was one of his greatest punchlines that he would always put in private conversation.
Rumors of political ambitions on the general's part only make the situation worse. A young aide on MacArthur's staff is Lieutenant Alexander Haig.
MacArthur, as a result of Inchon, began increasingly to surface as a potential Republican candidate for president. Let me tell you from firsthand experience, when presidents suspect they have competition, they're going to take care of it. And MacArthur had to go.
MacArthur steadfastly has refused to accept any responsibility for the sudden turn in Korea, while publicly blaming Washington. Truman says, "I could no longer tolerate his insubordination." MacArthur is out.
General Douglas MacArthur comes home to his native land. San Francisco stages its mightiest reception, a tumultuous cheering demonstration that sets the key for the nation's welcome.
Julius Caesar was not received in Rome any better than General MacArthur was received all over this country.
It is the first time in 14 years that MacArthur has been on the American mainland. Two-thirds of the public say they are outraged by the firing, at least in part because of the way in which the general received the news. A series of embarrassing bureaucratic missteps result in MacArthur hearing of his dismissal not through official channels, but over the radio.
It is past midnight in Washington, but the MacArthurs find a welcoming throng of 12,000 at National Airport.
MacArthur's address before Congress is a masterpiece of political theater, at once defiant yet filled with self-pity. His military career shattered, the defeated but proud MacArthur defends himself to the very end.
Efforts have been made to distort my position. It has been said in effect that I was a warmonger. Nothing could be further from the truth.
While 20 million people watch on TV, MacArthur bitterly ends his career by remembering a favorite military ballad, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away."
And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
To Truman's relief, MacArthur's star does eventually fade away. In 7 weeks of Senate hearings, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other witnesses destroy MacArthur's credibility and back the president's decision to fire the American hero. With MacArthur out of the way, Truman begins looking for a settlement to the war in Korea. By June of 1951, both sides are in a stalemate, facing each other at roughly the same point where the war had begun. On June 25th, an exact year after the first North Korean invasion, Ridgway receives dramatic news from Washington. The Chinese want to talk peace.
first films from Korea of the fateful truce negotiations with the enemy. At Munsan, 3 colonels, 2 U.S. and 1 South Korean, depart by helicopter for a rendezvous at Kaesong.
What the negotiators and the troops do not know is that another 2 years will pass before there is an armistice. Another 12,000 Americans will die while the two sides haggle over the bargaining table. But for many of the troops who have survived this first bloody, surprising, agonizing year, it is time to go home. The Chinese return as heroes. Although his troops have been driven back, Mao has established China as a world power. The Americans, battle-weary and worn, are happy to have made it through the nightmare.
Elation. I'm going to see my wife, my 2 children again. I'm going to get away from this bathtub of blood that I've been in. I'm going to live.
For the 7th Cavalry, whose predecessors had ridden into certain death with George Armstrong Custer, a year face-to-face with some of the worst fighting of the war is rewarded with a ticket back to the States. A thankful and wiser Ray Moran has some unfinished business.
I can remember all through the war not hugging my dad when I left. I can remember that like it was yesterday. And I said, when I get home, I'm hugging my dad. And you know, that bothered me because I thought I was such a big guy when I was leaving home. And my dad went to hug me and I just gave him a handshake like, well, this is what men do, Dad, you know. But I found out, hey, it's all right to hug. And I was going to give my dad the biggest hug in the world whenever I got home.
At the end of World War II, veterans returned home to a jubilant America with total victory in hand. Now, just 6 years later, the America Ray Moran and the other GIs returned to is growing sick of the fight in Korea, a war with no end in sight. Unlike their World War II counterparts, for the Korean War veterans, there are no drums, no bands, no cheering crowds.
When I returned to the United States and saw an America which was sitting at home, fat and sassy, watching the newly introduced phenomena of television, and a total lack of concern for the lives of the wonderful young men that were squandered by an ill-prepared nation in an ill-directed conflict, I became quite bitter.
For some, however, the welcome is far more cordial and heartfelt. In the small Pennsylvania town of Latrobe, Ray Moran's father has been praying for the safe return of his boy. On July 10, 1951, the same day as those first tentative peace talks in Korea, a joyous homecoming.
He saw me. I was walking, I'll never forget this, with my duffel bag on, and I'm walking, and he looked up from the porch around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and he jumped right off the front porch and come right at me, and I threw that duffel bag down, and I gave him a big hug, and all I said to him was, Dad, I'm awful sorry I didn't hug you when I left. He said, you're giving me the best hug I ever had now.
Captain of the Color Guard, will you please post our colors?
The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. But on this day, it is remembered.
We come here today on this Memorial Day to honor our fallen heroes.
At the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., they have come to pay tribute to the brave ones who fought and died in that distant land of fire and heat, ice and blood. Today, a state of war still exists in Korea. At the demilitarized zone separating North and South, the Cold War lives on. A truce was declared in 1953, but a peace treaty formally ending the war between the Koreas has never been signed. While the democratic South prospers, the communist North remains an isolated, militaristic state, plagued by famine and destitution. The fact that South Korea exists is proof to most that the war was worth fighting, that the last full measure the troops offered made a difference. More than 54,000 Americans died there. Some 148,000 Chinese were killed, as were untold millions of North and South Korean troops and civilians. On that distant Asian battlefield, the world dodged a bullet of mighty proportions. The price? Millions of lives. At a time in hell that sorely tested the ability of free people to resist, survive, endure.
Our young men stood the test of battle, and they stood it well. They stayed, they fought. And I don't know what else you can ask an American to do.